Have you ever wondered what the light path node does? Well, in today's video, we're going to break down every single output and how you can use it and why everything works. It's a really underrated node. However, there are a few caveats, which we'll explain. The first thing that we need to know is that there's two types of rendering engines. The first type is called ray tracing, and the second type is a rasterizing engine. Now, an example of a ray tracing engine is Cycles, and rasterizing is Eevee. Now, these render out scenes in completely different ways, which you have to understand to make the most out of the light path node. So in ray tracing, suppose you do have your camera present over here. The camera has different pixels present, and it's going to shoot out a ray for every single pixel. Now, for each pixel, the number of rays that it shoots out is equivalent to the number of samples that you have. So each pixel, if you have 32 samples, is going to actually shoot out 32 different rays in random directions. This ray is then going to interact with your scene, so all of the different objects that you might have, along with all the lights and stuff, and it's going to actually bounce. It's going to maybe hit this surface and then bounce and hit the light and things like that. And after all of the bounces, whatever the value is going to be registered. And when you take 32 samples, it's going to do that 32 times and average that out to get the actual value or color for that pixel. Of course, this was a much simplified explanation, but this is the base concept for ray tracing. On the other hand, rasterizing involves going in the exact opposite direction. So if you do have your camera present here, it is your scene that's going to be casting out light that directly goes and hits the camera in the individual pixels that are present. So that's why things that are present behind objects are completely hidden out from the camera, and they don't even interact with these objects, which is why Eevee does not produce realistic results. And even if you do have some sort of reflections occurring, they have to be faked using screen space reflections and things like that, which have to be enabled separately. And even those are not too realistic, but they just get the job done for stylistic renders. However, because there isn't any bouncing around and things like that, it happens much faster, and that's why Eevee is a real-time engine and it happens to render out in less than a second. On the other hand, Cycles takes a long time to render because it has to shoot out all of these rays, they have to undergo the bounces, and then it has to average out the value. The light path node makes use of all of these bounces and can manipulate each of these rays based on what the ray is actually doing. So now let's talk about the types of rays that are present. In Blender, or Cycles at least, there are four major types of rays. The first one is a camera ray, the second one is a reflection ray, the third one is transmission, and the fourth type is shadow. So suppose we have the camera and we have a few objects present on our scene. So we just have one sphere present here and we have a light source over here. When our camera shoots out a ray, this first ray that comes out is called the camera ray. So we'll label camera ray as 1, 2, 3, and 4, and we'll point those out over here. So this is a camera ray. Similarly, every other ray that directly comes out from the camera and hits any object whatsoever is always going to be a camera ray itself. But as we said, these rays interact with the objects and then move around. So any object is always going to actually reflect off rays. So this ray that has been reflected off of this object is going to be a reflection ray. Similarly, when we have a ray that comes off of some surface and has to pass through another object to get to a light source, this particular ray that we have is going to be a shadow ray, because essentially this light source is going to be casting a shadow and this particular ray is going to be within that shadow. So this ray is the shadow ray. Transmission ray is what we'd get if this object was slightly transparent or translucent. So let's say we had a camera ray like this to an object like this, which is maybe a glass block. This ray is going to actually refract and pass through this block. So this refracted ray is going to be a transmission ray. Now, each of these rays can have different properties, specifically for the reflection and transmission rays. Because when this ray gets reflected, it could be reflected off of two types of materials. Either a nice glossy material like a mirror or anything that produces specular reflections, or it could come off of a diffuse material like a rock or something like that. And the material does not have to be perfectly diffuse or perfectly glossy. It could be anywhere in between. So the reflection ray is going to have three different properties. The properties that it has is diffuse, glossy, or singular. So diffuse implies that the ray that came out is coming off of a material that has some amount of roughness to it. And hence the ray that came out is not going to be following the laws of specular reflection, and this angle is not going to necessarily be equal to this angle. So it'll come out in random directions. Glossy is how well the light is actually following the law of reflection, where this angle is always going to be equal to this angle. And these two are essentially a measure of how diffuse it is or how glossy it is. On the other hand, singular is simply going to be a true or false value, which means it's going to return a value of 0 or 1, where it's going to be 0 if it's not completely glossy or completely reflective. So in case of reflection, it'll give out a value of 1 if it is perfectly glossy. If there's absolutely zero roughness on the surface and it is 100% glossy, the singular will give out a value of 1. So the same three properties is present for transmission as well: diffuse, glossy, and singular. So diffuse and glossy are the same as before, except the difference is that in transmission, the light ray is actually going to pass through the material. And of course, if there's some amount of roughness, it's going to have slight variations in these angles, which is going to make it diffuse. Glossy is going to be perfectly following Snell's law, which implies that the IOR will perfectly determine the angle at which the light ray comes out of the object. And singular implies it is perfectly transparent, which means there's no amount of roughness present in this particular object. So those are the different types of rays and how they're used. But just like before, the best way to actually understand this is by looking at examples. But before we get to the examples, you need to know that because Eevee is a rasterizing engine and all of these different light paths aren't even present, the light path node has major limitations. We can't directly use the Eevee engine for most applications, except for the is camera ray. For everything else, there are a few workarounds. We'll explain that at the end of the video. And with that, let's actually start off the examples. So here I have a scene where we've already switched the render engine to cycles. I have the sample set at a very low amount to 4 because my laptop can't really handle cycles that well. But 4 cycles with denoising yields good enough results. For the actual scene, I have 2 planes present behind Suzanne, and I have a cube in front as well as a floor plane. I also have a light source present behind Suzanne, which is lighting up the entire scene, and the world background is kept to white. This plane, if you actually look at the material, is completely metallic with a very low roughness, which means it's more or less glossy and reflective. This plane has a metallic value of 0 and a roughness value of 1, which means it's completely diffuse. Instead of the principled BSDF for both of these, you could have simply used a glossy BSDF for this one and a diffuse BSDF for this one, but using the principled BSDF is fine enough. For this block in front, we want it to be glass, so we've gone ahead and increased transmission all the way to 1, and I've reduced the roughness down to 0.1 as well. Again, we could have just used the glass BSDF and that would have worked just as well. Now the entire effect is going to come out from the material that we add onto Suzanne. So let's press 0 to go into our camera view and go back to our rendered view, and let's press this plus button to give Suzanne a new material. The main way we can use the light path node is by mixing out different shaders. So let's remove the principled BSDF and search for a diffuse BSDF and directly plug this into the surface and change the color to whatever we want. So let's say that the base color is going to be this bluish color. Now the reason why I'm using these colors is so that it's very easily noticeable. Right now you can see that the blue color is being reflected off of this plane and it's passing through this glass, and even on this diffused surface there's a little hint of blue happening around the ears and things like that. I don't know how well you'll be able to see this with YouTube's compression, but it is slightly present. Now we can press Shift A and search for a mix shader node, plug that in here and use a different color as the second shader. So let's make this one the exact opposite of red. Now when we plug this in, we're going to get a mixture of both the colors based on this factor, and because they're polar opposites, we're going to get white because we get the mid value of this, which is white right here. However, we can press Shift A and search for a light path node and start playing around with each of these values. So let's take this is camera ray and plug it into the factor, and now you can see if a ray is coming directly from the camera and hitting the object, the value is going to be 1, so we get this diffused output. On the other hand, all of these colors that are coming through the glass or through the reflection are first going through the glass and converting into a transmission ray, or in this case it's hitting the plane and converting into a reflection ray. And that's why this no longer sees this value, but it sees the diffuse value. This is the one thing that works even if you are on Eevee, and that's pretty cool. But let's say I want the shadow to have a different color. So instead of the is camera ray, I can take the is shadow ray and plug that into the factor. To actually make the shadow a different color, instead of the diffuse down here, we're going to have to use a transparent BSDF. So we can plug this into the shader, and if we change the color to maybe green, you can see that if any shadow is present, the shadow is going to have a greenish tint. So if you actually see, there are shadows being created around the ear region, and even in the reflections, all of the shadows are always going to be green. So that's how you use the is shadow ray. If you want to use the diffuse ray, you can plug that in, and we have to plug the diffuse back into the shader so that we have the diffuse nodes going into the different shaders and the is diffuse ray going into the factor. You'll now see that there's a bit of red present through the transmission transmission as well as through the reflection. So those red regions are the areas where there's some amount of diffuse reflections occurring. If we hide away the cube, you can see the reflections occurring from the floor plane even more. For the floor, we can just add in a nice diffuse material, and you can see any ray that's actually hitting the Suzanne after bouncing off the floor is going to get this reddish color. So now let's use the Glossy ray. Here you can see the rays that are reflected off of the glossy surface as well as the slight glossy reflections that are occurring through the transmission are both going to be red. Similarly, if we take the singular ray and plug that into the factor, you see nothing takes on this diffuse value because for each of these materials, we see there's a little bit of roughness, and if there's a little bit of roughness, there's a little bit of diffuse within it. On the other hand, if we simply take this roughness and make it 0, it's going to become a singular ray because it's purely reflective, and that's why it becomes 1. We can do the exact same thing with the glass block that we have, reduce the roughness down to 0, and it instantly becomes red and takes on the other values. But as long as there's any amount of roughness, it's not going to be a singular ray anymore. It's going to have a mix of some amount of diffuse and some amount of glossiness. Now we can use the reflection ray, and that way only if it's a reflection ray, it's going to take on this red value. So you can see even though there's transmission over here, because we're no longer looking at glossiness and we're looking at only reflection ray, we get only the reflected area to be red. Similarly, if we switch this to transmission ray, only the area that goes through the glass is going to actually come out to be red. Now we can actually look at the ray length. If we plug the ray length into the factor, we get something weird. So the way we have to understand this is that the ray length is not going between 0 to 1, but it actually just depends on how far away the length is traveling or the ray is traveling. So let's say we had one ray that's going just like this. If this is going through 5 meters, the length is going to be 5 meters long. Since this mixed shader is going between a value of 0 for this and a value of 1 for this, essentially if anything is less than 1 meter or the ray is less than 1 meter, it's going to take on this, and if it's greater than 1 meter, it's going to take on this. So in our camera view, we can see that Suzanne is very far away from the camera, and that's why it's going to take on this value because it's getting clamped at 1 itself, so it takes this value. On the other hand, the length of the ray that's going between the glossy surface to Suzanne is actually less than 1 meter, and that's why we see that it is blue over here. Similarly, for the reflection, just this ear region is very close to the ear and less than 1 meter, and that's why this ray length is actually less than 1, and that's why it's taking on this diffuse. But as we go further away, the reflection ray is a lot longer, and hence it takes this. But you can control this easily using either a map range node or simply taking a math node and switching this from add to divide. Now if we divide it by a larger value, you can see how we get even more region to become blue, and we get a transition like that. So if we were to take this and just grab it on the y-axis and move it further away from Suzanne so that it's greater than 2 meters, if we look through it, it's still going to be red. But as we move it closer to Suzanne, because the ray length is starting to decrease between this glass block and Suzanne, it's going to slowly transition from red to blue. And you can actually get pretty cool effects by animating things like that. You could potentially use this ray length in many more ways, but I'll leave that up to you. The next thing is ray depth. Now, ray depth determines how many times there's actually been some sort of reflections or transmissions, or how many times it's interacted with different surfaces after it exited the camera. So since this is an integer, we can actually control this using another math node, and we'll switch it to subtract. So right now, if we subtract a value of 0, if the ray depth is 0, it's going to take in this value. And that means because these regions are directly coming from the camera and hitting Suzanne, it's going to take on this one. But all of these reflections, transmissions, the ray already interacted with a different object, and that's why it's taking this. On the other hand, suppose I subtract a value of 1. This region remains red because it's actually interacting with 2 surfaces on the glass. The glass block actually has thickness, so there are 2 surfaces that it refracts off of, and that's why it's still red. If you switch the value to 2, you see just these edges have the red tint because those regions actually had 3 bounces before it actually hit Suzanne. So light went in, bounced around 3 times, and then hit Suzanne. You can control how many times the light can bounce around in your render settings itself under light paths. So you can see, for me under Glossy, I can have a maximum of 4 bounces, and for transmission I can have a maximum of 12 bounces. So if I reduce this down to 1, there's going to be very few bounces, and that's why this darkens off really fast. On the other hand, this will actually help me render much faster. So you have to strike a balance between what's necessary and what's not to get perfect render speeds, but essentially the ray depth is going to have a maximum value based on this value over here. If this value is kept down at 4 or 5, the max ray depth is also going to be 4 or 5. Similarly, if we take this plane and actually make this one completely metallic with low roughness, and let's rotate it a bit more, you can see that on this particular surface, we have a reflection of the reflection. So because we have a reflection of the reflection, when we subtract a value of 1, we get a ray depth of 2. So we can change the subtract value to 1, and because the ray depth is 2 in this case, because it is reflecting off of this right hand side mirror and then hitting the left hand side mirror, it actually has a ray depth of 2. So if we subtract 1, we get a factor of 1 and it takes on this particular diffused value. So that's why this becomes perfectly red. So if you had even more reflections occurring, such as an infinite mirror, you could have them continuously changing colors. We'll deal with that in a while. However, there's also this diffuse depth and glossy depth, which are the exact same things, which is the number of bounces, but only for diffuse materials and for glossy materials. So if we go to this diffuse depth, remember our Suzanne is diffuse, we can subtract a value of 0. And now whenever there's one diffuse reflection, such as over here, it's going to take on the reddish value. So all of these reflections have this reddish value in the diffuse section over here. Glossy depth is for all of the glossy materials. So anything that has glossiness is going to take on a value of 2. We can subtract a value of 1, and that way only the second reflections are going to take on the red value, second and above. So second, third, fourth, and so on and so forth. If we change the value to 2, only the third reflections are going to take on that value. But in this case, everything reflects at most twice, so nothing becomes red. Now we have a transparent depth, which is actually very, very useful. So right now we don't have any transparent materials present. Remember, transparent is different from transmission. So even if we do have this glass plane, it's not considered as a transparent material. So let's just add that in by pressing Shift A and adding a plane. We'll press RX90, GZ, and we'll just bring it in front of Suzanne. So now we have this plane present right here. We'll press this new button to give it a new material, and we'll delete the principal BSDF, and instead we'll search for a transparent BSDF. Now when we plug this in, it should become completely invisible. However, if we were to now select Suzanne and directly plug transmission depth into the mixed shader, wherever a light ray is passing through any transparent material, the value increments by 1. So in this case, because there's only one transparent material, the value becomes red over here. If you take this same transparent plane and press Shift D, Y, and bring it further in front, for our Suzanne material, we can actually duplicate this mixed shader, plug it in here. We'll subtract a value of 1 and plug this into this factor, and take this diffuse, press Shift D, and change this to maybe a yellow color and plug it into the shader. So now whenever a light ray is going through two different transparent planes, it's going to take on this yellow value. Otherwise, it's going to take on this red value. And if it's not going through any transparent plane, it's going to take on this blue value. So that is pretty cool because the transparent planes cannot be seen, but you can use it to create really fun effects by just moving your camera around. So if we just shift our camera, you can see how the actual colors are changing as well. And you could create very trippy animations using this technique. And this setup can actually be used for any of these versions as well. So maybe instead of this is transparent ray, I can say if it's a shadow ray, I want the shadows to be red. But if it's a glossy ray, I want it to be yellow. Remember, we need to use a transparent BSDF to give the color for the shadows. So let's plug this into the shader. And that way you have red shadows being cast from a blue object that gives yellow color reflections. So that's super cool, but you can make it even better. Let's say you don't want any reflections to occur for Suzanne, but you want the reflections of other objects in your scene to be present. So let's add in maybe another UV sphere. Let's just scale it down and move it here. We'll give it a nice red material. And now there's a reflection occurring for this UV sphere, but I don't want Suzanne's reflection to occur. So what I can do is select the Suzanne material, and now I say if it's a glossy ray, I just make it completely transparent. So duplicate the transparent node, make it completely white, and plug this into the second shader for this mixed shader node. So now Suzanne does not have any reflections, but this ball does have its reflections. And similarly, because it's an is glossy ray, Suzanne also does not pass through this particular glass block. If I want it to only not be present in reflections, I can choose is reflection ray and plug that into the mixed shader. So that's how you can actually combine these to create really cool effects and have each thing separate for each effect that you want. Transmission depth is the same thing as diffuse depth and glossy depth, and you can use it based on your transmission. So let's select the Suzanne material and just use transmission depth into the factor. So that way, if it's going through one single transmission, it's going to take a value of 1. And suppose we have 2 of these blocks. So let's press Shift D, Y and just bring it in front. We can add in a math node, switch it to subtract. And if we subtract a value of 1, we're still going to get yellow because remember, there are multiple surfaces that this is interacting with. So it's going to have to go through 1, 2, 3, 4 different faces before it reaches Suzanne. So we actually have to subtract a value of 4, and that way it'll become completely blue. Even if we subtract a value of 3, we'll have yellow color because the transmission depth is 4 for this case. But just like before, we can add in mixed shaders. Let's duplicate this diffuse, make it red, plug this in, and let's take this output and plug it in here. And by playing around with these math nodes, you can see that if we have a transmission depth of 2, it's going to have in this yellow value. If we have a transmission depth of 4, it's going to take on this red value, and we can actually change all of these up to create various effects. So that was every single output when we're actually using the Cycles render engine. But what happens when we switch to Eevee? Instantly, everything becomes very bland. So let's just delete the things that we don't require and make sure that you have screen space reflections and refraction switched on. And for every one of these materials, you're gonna have to go to the material properties and switch the blend mode to actually make it refractive. And now we have a glass block that we can see Suzanne through. You have to make sure screen space refractions are switched on as well. And this is what we have. However, with Suzanne, none of these nodes actually work, and there's a few things that we have to set up before we do that. But the first thing that works directly is the isCamera ray. So let's say Suzanne is supposed to be blue. If we take this isCamera ray and plug it into the factor of the mix shader and mix it in with red, we're going to see Suzanne as red. But unlike before, all of the reflections as well as the refractions are all going to be red as well, because again, this is a rasterizing engine, and so screen space reflections and refractions and all of that is faked based on what the camera sees. So if the camera is seeing red, no matter what the actual colors are, the reflections and refractions are also going to be red. So that way, the best way we can use the isCamera ray is if we actually use it in the world properties, where we can add in 2 different backgrounds, which are going to help light the scene. But if it's a camera ray, the camera will be something else. So let's search for a mixed shader, plug the 2 backgrounds in, and then a light path node, and take the isCamera ray and plug that into the factor. So that way, everything is being lit using this one, but our camera is going to see the background as black. So that's very useful for Eevee, but let's look at what else can be done with Suzanne. If we want to use any of these other values like the shadow ray, diffuse ray, glossy ray, and things like that, the first thing that we have to do is use something called an irradiance volume. So we go to light probe and choose irradiance volume, and now if we switch on overlays, we can see what it looks like. So this will help us bake the indirect lighting. So let's just scale it up so that everything within our scene fits. And now we can go to our render properties, go down to indirect lighting, and just choose bake indirect lighting. So when we bake indirect lighting, we can't actually make changes to objects that are present in the scene without messing up the indirect lighting that has been created. So once you've baked in the indirect lighting, if you want to actually have the reflections as something else, so let's select Suzanne, and let's say if it's a glossy ray, we want it to be red, otherwise we want it to be blue itself, you'll see that it doesn't work with screen space reflections. However, if we just hide this cube, take this plane and change it to a reflective surface like glossy, plug that into the surface, reduce the roughness, and then press Shift A and search for a light probe reflection plane, we can just scale this up and press GZ to position it. You can see that the reflection from the reflection plane is going to now be red. So that's the only way you can actually use this is glossy ray and things like that. Is singular ray does not work. And all of these reflection ray is the same as just is glossy ray and so on and so forth. Ray depth does not have a value. Similarly, ray length doesn't work too well. Ray depth takes in the ray depth while the indirect lighting was baked and things like that. I haven't been able to successfully use these too well. So it's really up to you to experiment and figure out. But that was the basis for this node in Cycles and the little bit that you could do in Eevee. I hope this was useful and you're able to create really cool animations and things like that using this technique. And definitely if you use Cycles, then the light path node is a must use. You can create abstract animations and even ghostly characteristics and things like that with this node. And I'd really like to see all the different ideas you all come up with. If you like this one, I have another video where I explain the vector math node. Definitely check that out. And I post videos every single day. So I'm sure you're going to find something or the other on my channel informative and useful. So until my next video comes out tomorrow, keep creating and don't forget to stay creative.